When it comes to driving, you're probably familiar with the idea of a legal limit. You measure the amount of alcohol in someone's breath or saliva at the side of the road, and if it's above a certain concentration, law enforcement can presume that person is too impaired to drive. And having a specific cutoff number is a good thing, in theory anyway. It gives us a way to tell if alcohol is being used in a way that could endanger the user or other people. And with legal marijuana becoming more common, you'd think similar sensible safeguards would come into existence. But they haven't. Some states in the US, like Arizona or Rhode Island, have zero tolerance for driving after consuming cannabis. Others, like Illinois, Nevada, or Washington, take an approach like we have for alcohol. They've set a specific limit for THC, the psychoactive compound in weed, ranging from 1 to 5 nanograms per milliliter of blood. The trouble is, that doesn't work. See, cannabis is just so weird in how it affects the body that we just don't have a good test for what constitutes high driving. And the more we learn about cannabis, the more some researchers think we may never have one at all. To understand why THC impairment is so hard to test for, we first have to understand why testing for alcohol impairment is so easy. We have decades of research about how alcohol is metabolized, that is to say, how it makes its way from the mouth, around the body, and eventually to the liver. Plus, we know how the concentration of alcohol changes at each of those points. This is important when it comes to testing because it means measuring the level of alcohol in the blood or breath soon after drinking is a reliable indicator of the levels in other parts of the body that are much harder to get to. And we know how alcohol affects our brains, and therefore how it affects our behavior and reaction times, the kind of things that make driving under the influence dangerous. Once someone hits 0.03 grams of alcohol per 100 milliliters of blood, they might be more confident, and by 0.09 grams, they might not be able to think so critically anymore. By 0.25 grams, some people lose the ability to control their movements. That strong base of evidence means most countries around the world feel confident adopting a limit for blood alcohol around 0.05 grams of alcohol per 100 milliliters of blood, right before they get drowsy or their vision gets too blurry. There's a number, it can be reliably measured, and it roughly applies to everybody. When we're talking about marijuana, we're talking about the molecule that is most likely to mess with your ability to drive, THC. That's as opposed to other molecules like CBD. Pretty much everything that makes alcohol easy to test for doesn't work when it comes to THC, starting with how it's metabolized. It's possible to detect THC in blood plasma just seconds after the first puff, with the concentration peaking around 8 minutes later. After that, THC just loves hanging around in fat, so it quickly makes its way to any organ that's really fatty, like lungs, the liver, and of course, the brain. That means within literal minutes, the level of THC in the blood is much lower than that in the brain. And right now, the only way to check the level of blood THC is to have a professional draw blood. There are saliva tests, but we'll come back to them. And since most police officers don't have a phlebotomist riding shotgun, after an accident or suspect DUI, this can take hours, meaning blood levels are likely to have gone down even if the person did have a recent exposure to cannabis. THC is then metabolized by the liver, a process that can take an average of 12 to 60 hours, depending how frequently the person is exposed to cannabis. There's also this other weird phenomena where blood THC levels can peak a second time a few hours later after exposure, as metabolized versions of the compound move back into the blood from the liver. All that means taking a single snapshot of your body from a vial of blood simply isn't going to tell you how much of the mind-altering substance is in the place where it can, well, alter the mind. What's more, unlike alcohol, THC levels vary depending on whether it's smoked or eaten orally. If it's ingested, it can take hours for the level of blood THC to peak, and levels stay pretty low overall compared to smoking. And ingesting THC produces less of a high than smoking it. Or so I'm told, from research papers. And not only do THC blood levels vary depending on how someone takes it, but also how often they do so, because it accumulates in the body. Like, an occasional smoker might only have a trace of THC in their blood after a few hours, whereas someone who smokes every day can build up so much THC in their fatty tissues that it keeps seeping out for up to a month after their last exposure. So a habitual user might have a constant level of THC in their blood, even if their brain isn't actually high. So blood THC can't tell us specifically how recent someone's exposure was, how much they've had, or how impaired they might be. There just isn't a simple, single cutoff for THC like there is for alcohol, and there really can't be. We'll talk about what that means after this quick break.
This SciShow video is supported by Hungry Minds, an international creative group of more than 50 scientists, artists, architects, designers, and entrepreneurs creating unique cultural projects. They made a book. Well, not just a book, the book. It's a visual journey through the history of innovation that blends history, science, art, and design. This bestseller is an illustrated encyclopedia of humankind's greatest inventions and discoveries. Plus, there's a hidden quest in the book. See if you discover the secret puzzle within this intellectual and visual work. Those are generally the kinds of things that people who watch SciShow are into, and probably your friends and coworkers too, if you want to give it as a gift. It's called The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, and you can get it for 10% off if you click the link in the description, scan the QR code on screen, or use the code SciShow at checkout.
The question then is, even if a person isn't feeling high but has THC in their body, are they still too impaired to drive? After all, that's what's really important here, whether the person is putting themselves or others in danger. Remember, the blood level is just supposed to be a proxy, something we can objectively measure that stands in for what we actually want to know. At least one researcher says that heavy consumers can be cognitively impaired for up to 28 days after their last exposure. But one 2023 study found no correlation between THC levels in either blood or saliva and how well someone did on a driving simulator. And that study fit with a meta-analysis from a year earlier, which concluded that, quote, blood and oral fluid THC concentrations are relatively poor indicators of cannabis THC-induced impairment. Still, another simulated driving study from 2020 found that some people were barely impaired when over a certain limit, while others were highly impaired when under that same limit. In most of these studies, researchers are measuring things like how much a person weaves from lane to lane, or how close they are from the car in front of them. But we need some kind of measure that works on the road, not just in a lab. Because there's a widespread belief that consuming cannabis makes you a better driver, not a worse one. In fact, 82% of regular cannabis users said they would drive under the influence, according to one 2005 study. And most of them thought their driving would be only mildly impaired, or even better if they did. Well, according to a 2013 review, the whole better under the influence myth doesn't seem to be true. Several studies in that review linked driving under the influence of cannabis with fatal crashes, even when other factors like risky behavior or age were taken into account. And other lab-based studies said that it's more difficult for someone who's high to divide their attention between two tasks, or stick to a lane on a driving simulator. But maybe people think they're driving better under the influence of cannabis because they drive more slowly, potentially because they know they're high, so they're trying to compensate. Trouble is, they still drive worse than someone who isn't under the influence. So I hate to break the news to you, but you shouldn't drive stoned. So what do we do? If we can't find that magic number, is there any way to reliably check for cannabis impairment in the name of public safety? One solution that's been proposed is to collect capillary blood with a needle that automatically and easily does a pinprick draw on someone's shoulder. That could mean the police could get a result sooner than with a regular blood test, which would help overcome the problem of blood THC levels going down so quickly. Trouble is, these tests often underestimate the amount of THC floating around in the blood, and it doesn't solve the other problems like blood THC not always reflecting time of exposure. And what about testing some other fluid like saliva? Well, those tests have their issues too. They're less sensitive and less specific, meaning they're not as good at picking up subtle differences in THC levels and therefore whether someone is over the limit. Some studies have even said there will be a large number of false positive tests using this method. And I know what you're thinking, what about the good old-fashioned impairment tests? This could be something like walking heel to toe along a line or standing on one leg while listening to other instructions. You might have seen them in movies, and they're actually used in real life too. Except these tests aren't great either, for a couple of reasons. One is there's no universally agreed on task for measuring if someone is too impaired to drive. Combining three different tests, like in the standardized field sobriety test, is better, and ends up being around 86% accurate for alcohol at a blood alcohol content level of 0.05. But to get that kind of accuracy, you need to have trained professionals on the scene, and even then, it's still a subjective test. In one double-blind study, for example, DUI conclusions for cocaine or marijuana matched toxicology results in only 44% of cases, and 6 out of 16 people on a placebo were considered impaired when they clearly weren't. Plus, the full test lasts around an hour, so you kind of end up with the same problem as a blood test where some of the effects may have worn off already. And you, of course, can't use this kind of test in fatal crashes or for forensics. So for now at least, researchers are a little stumped. Maybe that's not a satisfying answer, but it's an uphill battle against basic chemistry and physiology, and knowing what we don't know is the first step to a solution. A single legal cutoff probably isn't it, which leaves researchers still searching for the test that actually works. The one that will keep drivers and those on and around the roads safe.